Dawn seeped across the alkali flat at 5 to 41, spring equinox, 154. Sagebrush snapped beneath a wind still tasting of winter, and the little white chapel waited, boards unpainted since the previous revival. Reverend Obadiah Shepherd stepped onto the threshold at 5 to 43, boots raising dust fine enough to sift through surge. He murmured the psalm of green pastures, while his left cuff collected two fresh ink spots shaped like teardrops. The bell rope moved without a congregation, clanging twice across 3 measured miles. Prairie dogs dove. Turkey vultures banked east. Obadiah closed the doors, set the iron latch, and aligned the strongbox so its brass corners glinted along the communion rail. The pulpit clock, halted at 40:44, threw a cracked sun circle across the pews. He logged the illusion, noting that souls sometimes travel in straight lines, while light does not. In the windowless sacristy, Sister Mercy Breyer folded Job's verses into paper funnels. Ivory pestle met marble mortar with the steadiness of a heartbeat regulator. White arsenic hissed, rose, settled again, 12 strokes clockwise, 12 back. Dust motes silvered by the lamp that smelled of mutton fat and bitter almond. 4 vials accepted measured powder. Poor Cokes sighed. She entered the season's first tally beside 1853's crowded margin. Inventory 28 ounces, served none, buried none. Then she blew out the flame, left darkness to tally its own. 6:10 rang from a clock she could not see. Flint Shepherd wheeled his cart across the yard, iron tires, scoring twin ledgers in dew-heavy dust. Fresh soil rode the box. 4 ox shoes, stamped 1853, knocked against an iron bar with the hollow note of distant communion tokens. From the ridge, brake chains squealed. Clara Plain stepped down from her brother's lead wagon, bonnet brim lifting toward the steeple that promised water if not salvation. She noticed the guest book propped on the lectern, April's dates already inked 14 days ahead, each name line virgin white. Yesterday's final entry glistened like a live bruise. A small traveler, voice thinned by altitude, asked why good ink would still run. Obadiah answered that mountain dews are stubborn. He closed the great book, and the bell spoke a third time, although no copse lay cooling. Flint lowered the handles. Live breath rose from the soil and married the smell of evaporating dew. Clara calculated the interval between stamped iron and wet inscription, while the bell's last echo measured a circle of silence no hymn had yet filled. Ledger. 3 bell strokes, 14 forward dates, 0 names, 28 odds on hand, inventory open. The wind shifted, carrying the faint clang of the third bell back toward the wagons. Clara's brother, Lemuel, called softly for her to fetch the water barrel. Yet her boots stayed planted on the chapel's single sandstone step. She felt the grit of alkali work through her soles, the same dust that filmed the guest book's marbled edges. From the corner of her eye, she saw Obadiah's thumb slide along the leather closure, smearing yesterday's ink into a black half-moon that matched the iron latch. Behind him, the pulpit clock still ticked at 4 to 44, though sunrise had already bleached the eastern panes, turning cracked varnish the color of old marrow. Inside, Mercy capped the last vial and slipped it into a cedar slot beneath the altar rail. Her fingertips came away powdered, the color of bleached bone. She wiped them across her apron, leaving 4 pale stripes that would not fade until wash day, if wash day ever came. The hymn she hummed had no ending verse. It simply circled, fountain meeting blood, blood meeting fountain, until the sacristy walls seemed to pulse with the same measured breath. When the third bell died, she lifted her head, counted the lingering vibrations, and wrote a quiet 3 beside the morning date. Inventory now matched prophecy. Flint dusted his palms against his canvas trousers, releasing a small storm of cemetery soil. The cart's wooden axle creaked once, twice, then stilled, as though the ground itself had swallowed the sound. He glanced toward the ridge. 7 wagons, 11 oxen, 1 child still asking why ink could stay wet through a mountain night. No answer rose, except the slow grind of iron shoes against iron bars, a lullaby of metal prepared a season early. He spat, cleared his throat, and stepped back, leaving the loaded cart parked like a promise beside the threshold, ready for whatever names might finally dry. The sun hung at the roof ridge, a pale coin balanced above the chapel cross, when iron tires first kissed quartz. The impact rang like a dropped anvil, and white sparks leapt, died, and left pin scorches the wind filled with alkali dust before the eye could blink. Mason Tinker rode the brake pole, spectacles flashing twin mirrored discs. He hailed the yard in the ringing voice of a man convinced ledgers remain open only for the living. Behind him, three wagons lurched, each slatted side brushed with the same green circle that ringed the iron-strapped crates within. Virtue Lark, Grayson descended before the wheels ceased groaning. A strand of mountain lupine slipped from her braid and scattered across the step, pale petals skimming the crust like moths too weightless to settle. She accepted Reverend Shepherd's steadying hand, answered that the trail had smiled upon them, and said nothing of the swollen ford that had swallowed two mules whole. Her wicker basket brushed Clara plain sleeve. A single pressed bloom caught in the calico fold, color already bled to the hue of old bone. On the parallel ridge, Marshal Grant Adams sat sideways on his clay bank, notebook flat against his thigh. He copied the chalk sigil freshly struck on Tinker's lead crate. Vertical bar, twin short strokes, the same figure he had sketched beside an abandoned Sweetwater freighter the previous October. The marshal closed his book, touched brim to crown, and turned downslope convinced that coincidence. Like calico, thinned with every washing. Inside the chapel yard, Obadiah welcomed the party with the identical cadence Clara had heard offered to last season's vanished pilgrims. The psalm drifted, settled on wagon tongues and harness brass, then dissolved into air already sharp with lie. She waited until the final syllable evaporated, knelt and trapped a petal beneath her thumb. The fragment felt weightless, yet carried the faint salt of river water. She slid it inside her cuff, where the pulse beat steady against borrowed color. Flint rolled the beam scales beneath the hanging lanterns at sundown. Iron plate rang beneath each crate. The beam dipped, leveled, and disclosed figures Clara had that morning pricked into her hem. 73, 55, 118. From the loft hatch she drew calico taut and added the day, 17 May, so memory might outlast dust. Reverend Shepherd offered crystal cups to merchant and niece alike, praising the mountain tonic as covenant drawn from snowmelt and scripture. Mason drank, tasted iron, and blamed the alkali springs west of the ridge. He drank again to prove goodwill. Mercy Briar received the emptied vessel, thumb circling the pale residue the way a banker tests fresh coin. She climbed the narrow stair, ledger balanced like a communion tray, and inked a new line. Mason Tinker, 167 pounds, $46.12. Value secured by hidden ingots rumored within crate number 2. Outside, Obadiah addressed the dusk. He spoke of shepherds who number their flocks before nightfall, of balances struck before the wolf wakes. Lantern flames bowed toward the congregation, elongating every profile until shadows overlapped like entries in a long account. Clara descended the loft ladder, fingers brushing the rail still warm from the deacon's palm. Beneath the lowest tread, a chalk stub lay forgotten, crescent-shaped, its curve matching the pale mark she had found on Mason's freight boxes north of the Sweetwater. She slipped the fragment into her cuff beside the petal. Powder kissed pulse, and both beat steady. A breeze disturbed the forge eaves where Flint had nailed discarded ox shoes. The iron rang once, twice, a thin chime that promised reckoning the way a distant bell promises Sunday. Inside, Mercy snapped her ledger shut. Ink beside Mason's weight still shone wet, though the cup's rust ring had already dulled. Ledger tallied thus: bell poised, weight recorded, price assigned, forward date pending. Night lay over the chapel like a lead apron. One oil lamp burned in the cellar, its flame narrowed to a pinhead that touched the barrel hoops and nothing else. Clara felt along the wall until the chalk grid found her palm. Date, visitor, avoirdupois, valuation, the column for her initials still blank in the worth line, though the weight 121 had been inked 2 days ahead of time. She unpinned the vial cork from her hem, pressed the scrap of psalm flat against the stone, and drew the faint crescent left by Mason's crate across one corner as proof of twin markings. The lamp hissed once, as though objecting. Mercy's tread crossed the kitchen boards overhead. Dust sifted through the cracks and settled on Clara's sleeves like cooled ash. Foot by foot, she slid the ledger from its shelf, using the vial as wedge so the leather spine would not creak. A fresh page showed Virtue Lark Grayson, weight 103, worth 38.5 shived, written in the same hand that had entered Mason Tinker. The date beside both names was tomorrow. Clara copied the figures onto calico, then folded the cloth around the chalk stub and cork, forming a parcel no thicker than a wafer. A single drop of laudanum remained inside the vial. She left it upright, stopper loose, so Mercy might believe her daily dose still taken. Upstairs, Flint wrestled with the forge bellows. Each pump sent a gust of cold breath through the grate and lit the kitchen ceiling rose red. He called for water. Mercy answered that the bucket was tainted with lye, advising him instead to sip from the tin ladle hanging by the door. Flint obeyed, though his cough doubled after the swallow. Outside, the moon grazed the ridge, silvering the 3 merchant wagons Mason had parked so confidently at noon. Ox shoes still dangled from the eaves, clinking whenever the breeze crossed the yard. Reverend Obadiah stood beneath them, coat unbuttoned despite the chill, and listened to the iron notes as a man might count rosary beads. He rehearsed tomorrow's psalm under his breath. The cadence was identical to the one Clara had heard him give the vanished settlers last season. The words spilled out in parcels of 7, the same measure Mercy used for drams of mercury. When the lamp in the cellar sputtered, Clara closed the ledger, but not before noticing a third line newly added between Virtue and Mason, her own initials again, this time followed by a question mark and the figure 120. Someone had shaved a pound from her future weight before the future arrived. She climbed the stair with the parcel clenched between forefinger and thumb. Each step counted to mask the creak. 12 boards, 12 heartbeats. At the 10th board, the kitchen door opened, framing Mercy's silhouette against the forge glow. Clara slipped the parcel into her mouth, tasting some ink and chalk grit, and stepped into view with empty hands. Mercy studied her, then offered a second spoonful of tonic to fend off night vapors. Clara swallowed, the chalk scraping like cold porcelain against her throat, and managed a steady nod of thanks. Obadiah entered, ledger tucked beneath his arm like a hymnal. He told Mercy the conversion chart required amendment, for the market price of mercury had risen 3 cents since sunset. Mercy replied that the adjustment would be made before breakfast. She turned to Clara and observed that rest would keep her complexion from turning sallow. Clara shaped the expected curtsy, but kept her lips closed lest the hidden parcel betray its outline. Across the yard, Flint secured the last trunk with a rope that had already begun to fray. He looped it 3 times, coughed once into the fibers, and nailed the knot flat to the boards with a single iron tack. The sound resembled a judge's gavel. The echo found the ox shoe wind chime and set it rocking, though no wind stirred. One clear note rang, followed by a second fainter strike, as though a distant pair of graves had opened and closed. Clara retreated to the loft, eased the shutter, and spat the parcel into her diary. The calico unfolded to reveal the chalk mark perfectly preserved. Beneath it, the ink had bled a crimson halo where her saliva met the psalm. She arranged the evidence in sequence: cork, stub, cloth, then flattened the diary beneath her mattress. Sleep did not come, yet her breathing slowed enough to let the night sounds rise: the chime, the bellows, Flint's cough, Mercy's chalk tallying something new. 10 miles northwest, Marshal Adams trimmed the ash from his small fire and spread the copied sigil beside the latest circular. He drew a line between the chapel steeple and the next settlement west, estimating water sources and travel hours. A coyote yipped twice. The iron chime answered from far off, carrying a note that did not belong to the range. The marshal closed his notebook, convinced the sound traveled against the wind only when something living had been measured and found wanting. Ledger. 3 names inked for tomorrow. 1 weight quietly pre-diminished, evidence parcel preserved beneath 121 pounds of sleeping witness. The wagon wheel spoke once, a dry bark against sand, and the sound lingered like a throat clearing before bad news. Mason Tinker steadied himself on the iron tire, tin cup trembling like a tuning fork that had lost its note. 3 nights prior, Clara had gulped the evidence. Tonight, the ledger again listed tomorrow beside his name. He tasted iron thicker than any kettle could brew, swallowed twice, and set the cup upside down as though to trap whatever crawled inside. A hush carried the anvil note across the flats. 3 measured strokes, the blacksmith counting a funeral not yet announced. Inside the loft, Clara knelt, diary open, graphite whispering across paper already warped by lantern steam. She watched Mason's knuckles blanch, counted 6 seconds until his knees folded. When he lurched behind the lead wagon, the wretch arrived dry. Then a black ribbon hissing upon cold sand. No reflection glinted in the puddle. The sky withheld comment. Clara recorded color, texture, absence of starlight, then knotted her hem to mark the hour. The knot felt heavier than thread should, as if the minute itself had mass. Mercy Briar appeared at 2. Silver spoon bright as a newly minted coin kept hidden from every till. She drifted between wagons, hem brushing sage already blanched by drift of lye. At Mason's tailboard, she pressed thumb to wrist, found flutter, and chalked mountain flux. Natural decrease in letters tidy as arithmetic. Dust from the stroke powdered her cuff like frost that would never melt. She blew on the letters to set them, the way grandmother's cool soup, then stepped back to admire the symmetry of the phrase. Virtue Grayson slept beneath a quilt, stitched with wildflowers now wilted inside her Bible. Mercy hummed 7 beats of There Is a Fountain, halting before the 8th, pleased by the tremor promising fever by sunrise. A dried larkspur detached, settled upon pine boards, violet against ochre like a bruise blooming in reverse. Clara, eye to canvas slit, drew spoon, hymn, flower, the line of chalk scoring wood. Bitter almond tinged the air. She refused to cough, afraid the scent would escape and mark her too. Obadiah watched through the hymnboard chute, quill noting 11 ounces gold saved beside Mason's name. He weighed apothecary cost to the grain, balanced profit like a deacon counting communion wafers. When Mercy returned the spoon to its velvet sleeve, he turned the ledger page, inked executed between 2 dates, the word as calm as weather. His lips moved, silently converting ounces to days of flour, bacon, coffee, then to the weight of a man's last breath. Dawn arrived pewter-thin. 4 new shovels leaned beside 4 chalk rectangles, sap beads gleaming like uncoined ore. Flint counted them low, 1, 2, 3, 4, his cough echoing the cadence, each exhale a cracked bell. Obadiah praised altitude sickness, urged fasting, eyes bright behind fogged spectacles. Settlers nodded, throats already narrowing, breath whistling a hymn no one taught. Their tongues felt thick, as if the song had been stitched inside while they slept. Clara approached Mason, where he sagged against a crate branded with the same sigil that marked Virtue's Bible. She offered needle and whispered warning. He answered with psalms about touching the Lord's anointed, voice reedy as dry reed. The words left his mouth in shreds, caught on his cracked lip, fluttered to the dust like moths too tired to fly. She retreated, diary heavy beneath her arm, mattress weight calling the hidden parcel home. Her thumb rubbed the knot in her hem, counting minutes backward, searching for the moment when warning could still matter. Marshal Adams camped 2 ridges east, copied sigils by firelight, measured chapel distance at 4 hours hard ride. He closed his notebook when the faint chime of ox-shoe irons drifted downwind, twin notes matching the shovel count. The sound always arrived, he noted, when a life had been weighed and stamped approved. He tasted iron in the air, same as Mason, but swallowed it down like a coin too smooth to spit out. Beneath the bunkhouse, Aunt Hortense woke to a different music. Knife-soft clicks of ledger pages turning under floorboards, each flick matching heartbeats she no longer felt in her own breast. She counted them aloud until the shovels outside answered 4, then drew blanket over ears, yet the rhythm persisted like distant hooves. Her fingers found the loose board, pressed until the nail head printed a crescent in her skin, a tiny moon to mark the hour of her waking. Clara climbed the loft, slid hand beneath ticking, confirmed parcel still dry. Cork, chalk, calico. She lay back, listened to pages and shovels exchange numbers, and for the first time weighed her own body in ounces of gold. The ledger tomorrow had her penciled at 120 pounds. She exhaled, felt the mattress subtract 1. Outside, a magpie landed on the wind chime of ox shoes, adding a fifth note that no one had ordered. The bird tilted its head, as if listening for the next cough, the next knot, the next page turning beneath the floor. Sun cleared the ridge, gilded spoon, shovel, spectacles, sap. Obadiah emerged from the trapdoor, locked it, brushed dust from coat. Flint lifted the last shovel upright, blade flashing like a pewter spoon, awaiting a meal already measured. A breeze stirred the ox shoe wind chime. 2 iron notes rang, traveled the yard, slipped under the bunkhouse door. Ledger pages turned beneath the floorboards, answering the chime with soft, knife-soft clicks, counting heartbeats that no longer belonged to anyone living. The milk light of dawn had thickened into pale brass when 33 adults filed across the chapel threshold. Bonnets dipped, boot soles rasped, the loose board sang its minor note. Obadiah Shepherd waited at the rail, chalice glowing like a coin fresh from the mint. He exhorted the circle to taste deliverance, words stripped so bare they clinked. One by one the settlers tilted the cup, swallowed, and resumed their kneeling rows. A haze of bitter almond rode the air. No one coughed, though eyes watered. Virtue Grayson rose last. Purple shadow flowered on her lip, where the metal had touched, bright as foxglove. She pressed 2 fingers to the stain, gazed at the color, and sat again, steady as a clock, whose spring still holds. Clara Plain remained on the bench, hands folded hard. She counted 17 audible swallows and felt her own pulse race ahead of the tally. Mercy Briar stood behind the altar, with a folded linen, catching drips before they could mark the pine. Each damp print disappeared into her apron, 4 in all, thumb pressed like wax seals. She never smiled, yet her shoulders loosened as if balanced accounts had just been posted. Sunlight climbed the east wall, revealing wagon grease on the communion cloth. Dust drifted through the beam, carrying the taste of cellar lye. Obadiah noted the final sip, snapped the ledger shut, and declared that a flock able to dose itself spared the camp unnecessary labor. The sentence hovered, settled, was absorbed into bowed backs. When amen was murmured, the crowd stepped outside. Sage along the path had already bleached beneath drifting potash. Clara lingered, knotting her skirt hem until the weave bit. She carried flint, tow, and a single cone of buffalo chips gathered while Star still held. Behind the forge she built a tidy mound, struck 1 spark, and guided the gray thread southeast toward the ridge where Marshal Adams kept night watch. 20 heartbeats the smoke climbed. At the 21st Mercy stepped from the vestry, arms full of hymnals soaked in the rain barrel. Pages slapped across the ember. Flame hissed, died, lifted again as thin, bitter ribbons. Mercy advised that signals invite wolves. Her tone stayed mild, gloves stainless, shoes whispering back to the chapel door. From the loft, Obadiah watched through the square aperture, pen poised above calfskin. He entered 612 beside the heading tinker, mason, and underlined the numerals twice. Proud, the schedule held below, Flint tested shovel edges on basalt, counting 5 blades aloud. His cough answered, metallic, echoing iron on iron. 10 miles south, the marshal saw the pale column bloom, then vanish as though pinched. He spurred, but chaparral and coulee kept him at a 4-hour remove. Clara nudged the ashes with her boot. Hymn sheets and white dust mingled like erased entries. She pocketed the cooled flint beside a cork printed Psalm 55, tasting lie on the rising wind. At the well Virtue found her, movements slow as a sleepwalker gauging cliff from floor. From her apron she produced a prairie star, the only violet still unwilted after frost. She pressed 5 petals into Clara's palm, naming each in a breath that smelled of bitter wine. Hope, memory, witness, name, return. When she withdrew, purple dye branded Clara's cuff, oval and bright. Obadiah watched from the step, remarking to Flint that communicants who pour their own poison spare righteous men the fatigue of persuasion. His voice carried. Several heads bowed lower. Sunlight glanced off the bell rope. One involuntary clang rolled over 36 existing mounds and the open chalked rectangle awaiting Virtue's measure. Clara closed her fist, feeling stem meet seam, aware the ledger upstairs kept a blank line hungry for ounces. Virtue studied the turning page in Obadiah's hand, understanding ink would soon demand her number, yet walking all the same. Footsteps receded toward wagons, toward shovels, toward sage already powdered white. From beneath the floorboards came the soft click of a knife easing paper over. Counting hearts no longer felt. 28 May 1854. Communion served 33. Smoke quenched 612. Shovels counted 5. Ledger awaits 6th heartbeat. Flint wheeled the barrow down the wagon path, iron tire chewing wet grit. Each revolution sounded a dull count. He dumped river loam onto a tarpaulin, stretched between 2 barrel staves. The soil struck with a moist thud, then answered itself, a bright chink, as though coins lay just beneath the roots. He knelt, brushing dirt from a porcelain doll's cheek, and set the toy beside Mason Tinker's field spectacles and an ox yoke still smelling of last summer's sweat. With a nub of school chalk, he priced them in neat figures. 50 cents, 4 bits, $2. Wind threatened the numbers. He wrote faster. Inside the parked wagon, Virtue Grayson lay on a quilt, breath fluttering like torn paper. Each exhale smelled faintly of bitter almond, Arsenic's polite signature. Clara Plain knelt behind the water barrel, skirt drawn up to shield her lap. Silver needle flashed as she stitched Flint's prices into her hem with doubled linen thread. Every cipher became a quiet affidavit should a court ever ask. Dust salted her tongue. She swallowed and kept sewing. Sunlight struck the needle, sending one brief glint across the empty prairie. No rider would see it. Mercy Briar arrived without footfall, hymn book pressed to her breast as if warming a hidden heart. She traded the porcelain doll for a glass vial no longer than a rifle slug. With gloved thumb, she smeared Flint's chalked price into an oval, erasing value as easily as breath. The vial joined its sisters inside her apron pocket. Flint noted the swap on a paper scrap, rolled it tight, and slid it into a brass tube already crowded with similar grains. Inventory, he seemed to decide, could be amended until the ground received the goods. Swallows crossed overhead, stitching sky to sky. Their wing beats echoed the buried chink of coins, a sound too light for burial, yet too sharp to ignore. Virtue whispered prairie flowers in falling order. Lupine, paintbrush, star thistle. The names tethered her to visibility. Clara entered the chapel, uncorked her travel ink, and wrote each bloom beside its market price. Lupine 18 cents, star thistle 15, so fragrance balanced against melt weight. When a tear threatened, she blotted it, called the mark sweat, and turned to the next line. Mercy passed the doorway humming, timing Virtue's respirations with a silver spoon. She tilted the bowl so reflected ovals marched across pine planks. Glint, shift, glint. Each shimmer recorded a breath. Absence would record its end. When Virtue's lips shaped prairie clover, Mercy's hum deepened, as if the plant were a wrong note. She tapped the spoon against the vials in her pocket, counting cadence against the dying. Obadiah Shepherd emerged from the sacristy, sermon page in hand. He recited over 4 fresh rectangles, scraped beyond the threshold, soil the color of rusted coins. Harvest tasted too gentle, He replaced the word with tithe, renaming murder as duty. The ledger hovered, awaiting weight. He tasted dust, cleared his throat, and tried seed time instead, then winnowing, settling finally on threshing floor. Satisfied, he folded the paper into his breast pocket beside the watch that no longer ticked. Dusk stacked violet clouds along the ridge. Marshal Grant Adams drew rein on the far bluff. 36 ochre mounds lay below him, few straight, each crowned by a raw stake. He opened his government notebook, inscribed the tally, snapped the brass clasp. The click slid downslope where spades still rang, clean as a gavel. 2 hours, perhaps less, separated his ink from Obadiah's. This half a mile west, Flint slid the forge bar home. A clay crucible accepted Mason Tinker's gold money belt. Buckle, coins, and engravings softened into pale fluid. Each pour bore the date when hated 54, numerals hissing as they met iron. Sparks corkscrewed up the flue, expired against night, and drifted back like black snow. The smell of molten metal carried a note of burnt hair. Flint breathed through his mouth and kept the bellows steady. Clara, returning from chapel, paused where wagon ruts met prayer house path. Furnace light painted false sunrise on cloud bellies. A tear-shaped bead of gold had leapt the mold and cooled between her feet. She lifted it with reverent haste, folded the nugget beside the cork and the violet petal already in her hem. Evidence now numbered 4. From the forge beam an ox shoe string swayed, iron rims kissed, producing a small dull chime. The same wind carried Marshal Adams' distant horse snort closer, always closer. Accounts above ground prepared to confront accounts below. Ledger entry, Virtue Grayson, 6 ounces, $1.37, bell yet to answer. Wind chimes count the balance. The marshal's heel struck the chapel porch plank once, a dry cough of wood answering from the hollow beneath. A puff of lye drifted up, sharp enough to bleach the dusk, stinging the nostrils with the memory of Sunday linen scrubbed too hard. He knelt, prized the board free, and lifted a cedar box the size of a hymnal. Inside lay the red-lined ledger, pages fanned like a fresh wound. 847 debits marched in iron ink, each figure crowned with a date, 17 June 1854. A bead of violet fluid still clung to the gutter, not yet dry. Adams snapped the book shut. The click carried the same pitch his notebook had made on the ridge, only now the sound stayed inside the building. Trapped by rafters that had heard every confession and kept none. He chalked his initials across the leather flap of his saddlebag, a white bar that matched the marks he had seen on ox yokes and toy crates moments earlier. The stroke fitted exactly, a mortis to tenon, and for the first time the law understood the ledger had kept him in view as faithfully as it had kept the dead. Clara Plain stepped from the sacristy shadows, candle guttering in her hand, wax pooling like cold tallow tears. She unfolded her hem and 4 objects slipped onto the pine bench. A cork flecked with psalm dust, a violet petal bruised purple-black, a thumbnail of crate, chalk still warm, a gold tear the size of a flax seed. She arranged them with the care of a seamstress spinning a pattern for a shroud. The marshal produced 4 paper envelopes, sealed each with cooling tallow, then slid them into an inside pocket next to his badge. In the hush they heard the faint chime of the ox shoe wind catcher swaying above the forge. A single cold coin spinning on iron. A deeper cough rose from the floorboards, metallic, impatient. Flint emerged from the stair pit, burlap sack across his shoulder. 6 gold bars glowed inside like ingots of sunset, their 1854 faces already cooling. Sparks freckled his coat. Each died before touching ground, yet the stench of molten theft drifted ahead of him like a herald. He crossed the yard at a trot, boots printing glassy craters that hardened before the next footfall. A brittle trail any child could read at dawn. At the cottonwood edge he paused, spat black into the dust, and vanished toward the river road. The forge chime answered once more, a note knelling departure, Deputy Hurlbut overtook Mercy on the narrow balcony stair. Iron cuffs clicked with the same cadence she had kept while timing dying breaths. She buffed the silver spoon across the shackles, slow circles that caught lantern light and flung it back like a taunt. When the iron closed, her hum broke mid-phrase, the first falter in 847 administrations. She offered no complaint, only studied the spoon's mirrored bowl as though reconciling accounts. Obadiah waited below, sleeves rolled, forearms freckled by ink that had seeped from page to skin. He recited Exodus in a calm bailiff's meter, declaring that firstborn debts demand firstborn coin. His knuckles drummed the railing, ticking invisible debits only he could see. When Adams motioned him toward the wagon, the preacher smiled, serene as a man settling a tab he believed divine. They formed a line across the yard, prisoners between deputies, boots scuffing dust already cool. The marshal flipped the ledger to its final blank leaf, and there, so faint it could be breathed away, tomorrow's date stood beside his surname in graphite. The letters wavered, still warm from the hand that forecast them. He closed the book softly, the way one closes a coffin lid when the occupant still looks asleep. Chains clinked, boots scuffed. The wind carried lie and molten memory across the yard. From the dark beyond the cottonwoods, the ox shoe sounded once more, a cold coin spinning on the rim of night. 847 D-beats, one name penciled for morning, balance pending. The territory courthouse, planed only weeks earlier, exhaled pine sap and camphor, as though each plank remembered the blade. October sun knifed through rifle slot windows and chalked white stripes across fresh sawdust. Settlers packed the rear pews, brim shadows sealing their eyes. Reporters ringed the rail, pencils poised like dowsing sticks above pocket tablets. An unlit lamp, its globe freckled with 32 dead flies, swayed above the prisoner's chair and kept slow time. Judge Elias Storm emerged, river silk beard brushing his ribcage, wagon beam gavel already raised. One knock rang the tin cuspidor. The assembly exhaled as one body. The bailiff hoisted the red-lined ledger, still smelling faintly of violet fluid, and laid it on the oak rail. Gold letters that once promised Good Shepherd guests glinted like a coin on a corpse's lid. The unnamed prosecutor opened at the scarlet ribbon. He read, without inflection, 3 entries. Age 4, 75 cents. Age 36, $45. Age 67, $2.30. The numbers dropped like horseshoe nails into soft wood. 9 jurors wept silently. Their tears speckled the dust and formed darker circles at their feet. Obadiah Shepherd sat unshackled, spine as straight as a survey stake. He smiled each time a debit crossed the air, fingers drumming 12 precise beats per line. When the prosecutor hesitated over Ansbach, the preacher kindly supplied the missing syllables, exhibiting the same warm recall once used to recite psalms at funerals. The correction hushed the room colder than any shout. Marshal Grant Adams rested a cedar box beside the witness chair. Within lay Clara Plain's 4 sealed exhibits: a psalm-dust cork, a violet petal, a crate chalk shard, a gold fleck folded in tallow. Adams lifted each envelope by its corner, allowing morning glare to strike the evidence like a second glance from the dead. Jurors followed the glint, pupils tightening. Clara herself stood sentinel near the press desk, bombazine skirt sweeping sawdust into tiny funnels. She produced a porcelain doll fragment no larger than a tooth, painted lashes still intact. Without ceremony, she pressed the shard into the foreman's palm until a bead of blood answered. No word passed. She merely blinked once, sealing instruction. Adams called Virtue Lark Grayson, too weak to climb the 7 granite steps. The girl testified from her wagon bed, voice threading the open sash. She fixed her first metallic taste to 3 of September, the coal burn to the 6th, the falling petals to the 9th. Each date nested against Mercy's dosage column as neatly as boxes in a peddler's cart. When her account faltered, Obadiah leaned toward the window and encouraged her to lift her voice. so the flock might judge the bleating. Several farmers looked at the ceiling beams. The odor of lye drifted in from the scrub-brushed hall. Mercy Breyer, gloved despite her irons, watched the wagon spokes through dusty glass. She murmured that she had leveled only compound, never soul, her chained hands tipping an invisible spoon. Level tip, while her reflection in dull silver showed no face at all. Adams noted the remark beside a fresh ledger column, ink branching like frost. Judge Storm demanded the final leaf. The page cracked like a pine knot. Motes rose, suspended numerals awaiting lungs. Tally stood at 847 debits, no credit entered. A wagon creaked outside. Inside, the air tasted of fresh shavings and old varnish. The jury retired behind an elk-skin partition. Onlookers hummed 7 hymn verses, the tempo slowing like a keelboat grounding. When the doors creaked open, the foreman carried a rolled verdict. A single tear slid from his eye and struck the fresh ink. Black rivers bled along oak grain, forming momentary figures 847, then vanished into dust. Storm pronounced hanging for both shepherds. Obadiah thanked the court for its audit and asked that the ledger be returned, so he might balance the closing entry. The bailiff replied by locking the book inside the cedar box already branded with the federal eagle. The key clicked, a sound smaller than a wafer breaking. Outside, the flag slid to half-mast. Inside, lye scent thickened as though the planks themselves had begun to sweat. Clara's skirt brushed the dissolved ink. She thought she heard pages turning beneath the floorboards, though the ledger now lay cedar-bound and mute. Marshal Adams recorded one final line in his diary: 847 debits, 1 tear, 0 acquittal. From the eaves, Oxshoe wind chimes faintly tolled, carrying the count into the breeze. Ledger tally: 847 settled, 1 pending. The iron count rides the wind. October's second dawn washed the former chapel yard in thin milk light. The gallows frame, raised overnight, stood where the communion rail had once cupped prayerful elbows. Its 9 treads still exuded the candle scent that had sanctified Advent for 20 seasons. Now braided with fresh pine sap and the sourness of churned earth, Marshal Grunt Adams walked a slow ellipse, heel-printing 11-inch craters he had learned on wagon trains west. From his coat he drew the hangman's table: 132 pounds, 11 feet 2, 181, 8 feet 4. Ink crusted before the figures could breathe, as if the numbers themselves feared the air. Spectators formed a mute half-moon. Coat collars shut, peppermint dust reddening the mittens of children too quiet for their age. No hymn rose. Even the crows waited on the fence line like dark punctuation marks. Their breath steamed in small private clouds, each one a prayer no one dared speak aloud. The smell of wet wool and camphor drifted between bodies, mixing with the faint iron tang of the river that carried yesterday's blood downstream. Clara Plain arrived with a folded worship sheet salvaged from the nave collapse. She aligned its watermark against a stack of fresh-wanted bills. The press bite matched. Paper that once announced glad tidings now hawked guilt, yet accepted either text without protest. She slid the page beneath her apron ribbon, beside foxglove seeds she would never plant again, the packet soft with last spring's hope. The seeds rattled like dry teeth when she shifted her weight. At the scaffold foot, a yardstick dangled, pencil hatch marks notched to ingot length. Adams lifted it, paused. Clara murmured that the rule once rested on Flint Shepherd's forge rack, the absent brother who melted wedding bands into nameless bars. A smear of gold dust clung to the marshal's glove like pollen on a moth wing. He hooked the stick back, the stain secure, a silent promise that measures once taken would not be forgotten. The wood creaked softly, remembering the heat of the forge and the weight of cloth once measured for wagon covers. 9 risers cast 9-foot shadows. The selfsame stick confirmed the measure, each footfall a ledger entry in wood. Reverend Obadiah Shepherd climbed unaided, cuffs ink dark where the ledger had bled onto his skin. He surveyed bonnets as though allotting bread, his gaze a final accounting. Judge Storm recited 847 debits, voice flat as freight wheels. Offered final speech, Obadiah declared, "A prudent shepherd culls the flock. The pasture abides." The front row shivered less from wind than from the tediness of his math, the neatness of a life reduced to columns. A woman in a black bonnet pressed her thumb against her palm hard, as if to hold something in. Sister Mercy Breyer followed, gloved hands folded like a deaconess. She breathed the first line of "There is a fountain," faltered, yielded to the canvas hood. Adams signaled. Twin traps replied with one compact thud. Skirts hung slack, coattails still, as though the ledger had prepaid every twitch. A communion leaf, pressed at dawn, gleamed from Obadiah's heel, the only green left in a world gone gray. The rope swung once, then stilled, a pendulum with no clock behind it. By noon, the scaffold stood tenantless, boards already the color of shin bone. Crows blackened the beam. Their weight drew a slow groan once answered by a bronze bell long sold to pay the marshal's wage. A clerk surrendered the cedar-locked ledger. Adams thumbed to a ghost entry. His own surname paired with tomorrow's date, now erased yet readable in its dent. Graphite lifted on the wind and vanished among prairie sage, a confession scattered to the four directions. The clerk's fingers trembled as he closed the lock, the click swallowed by the wide sky. Clara requested 3 virgin sheets from the clerk's satchel. The man hesitated, then tore. The reports cracked louder than the drop, a sound like breaking bone. She folded the squares beside the wilted violet petal Virtue Grayson had pressed between pages, a relic of a gentler time. The petal left a bruise-shaped stain on the top sheet, a ghost of color against the white. She pressed her thumb there, briefly, as if sealing a promise. Wanted posters for Flint, struck on hymn stock, were nailed to puce-on posts. Each hammer blow rang against wood once shaped by prayer knees, turning devotion into advertisement. The ink bled slightly in the dew, softening the edges of Flint's sketched face until his eyes looked almost human. A dog sniffed the base of one post, then trotted away, uninterested in the scent of paper and fear. Adams studied the southern road, voiced intent to chase the smith across the border. Clara answered that she would ride west, carrying paper unmarred by red ink. They mounted, noon sun glazing the gibbet arm to blinding white. Behind them, ox shoes on rawhide swung from the beam, chiming faintly, measuring absence like an unstruck bell. Ledger, 847 settled, 1 astray 0 bells. The sun had slipped to the western rim, a brass disk dulled by prairie dust, when the crew laid their crowbars beneath the first communion beam. Sap sighed from the century-old pine, nails squealed like short-lived things. Marshal Adams marked each timber in a pocket notebook, 36 beams for 36 mounds already measured on the ridge. His pencil lifted whenever an ox shoe, scavenged from Flint Shepherd's forge, clinked against the iron warning post. He spoke no praise, no blame. The count itself served as prayer. Clara Plain followed with a cedar shingle, chalk clicking while she struck out the altar sums. 847 debits vanished beneath one sweep, the figures ghosting the air as lie dust. She tasted the alkali, thin and clean, and recalled how the same powder had once bleached the reverend's collars. The wind carried the scent away, replaced by camphor escaping the nave's hollow spine. A workman muttered that the iron music sounded like a cracked bell. His neighbor said it reminded him of tallying coins. Both men fell silent when Adams glanced their way. When the ridgepole yielded, a downdraft lifted hymn book, confetti-pressed violet petals, thread-fine, spiraling like pale moths. One settled on Clara's wrist. She tucked it behind the blank ledger strap. Adams noticed, offered a nod, and moved on. Between them the compact held. Ink would guard the living, having already numbered the lost. Upon the ridge the soil lay forked and ready, each grave width still soft from hurried disinterment. Clara opened the pine seed crate rescued from the cellar. Paper packets, no larger than a child's palm, bore prices once matched to corpses. 3-cent larkspur, 5-cent flax, 2-cent shooting star. Her thumbnail brushed the figures. A bruise on the same thumb mirrored the graphite dents of earlier ledgers. Quiet arithmetic. The cost of bloom equaled the former price of bone. Adams produced a warped yardstick and ruled a 6x6 grid across the dust. He declared each square must sit above an unnamed sleeper. From his coat he drew the silver dosing spoon, its bowl scarred by years of tincture, handle thinned by nightly stirring. Clara pressed the spoon into loam, measured one portion, then another, letting earth darken the metal instead of arsenic. Row after row accepted its portion. The marshal tallied with chalk, each click faint as a clerk sealing an affidavit. 36 envelopes emptied, 36 hollows awaited rain. Dusk pooled violet across the plain. Adams closed the fresh ledger upon a flat stone, then reopened it so Clara could write 2 headings: spring stock, living names, autumn tally, safe passage. Between the lines she laid the brittle petal Virtue Grayson had pressed inside a Salter 2 winters past. The paper accepted the relic like a receipt. Wind funneled upward, struck the ox shoes nailed along the ridge, and drew from them a chime thin enough to pass for prayer. The marshal counted their covenant aloud. 1 ledger, 1 pencil, 36 hopeful seeds. He declared that arithmetic, once reversed, would now serve breath. Clara answered that ink preferred open ground, yet consented to stand guard. Together they looped twine through the ledger's spine and knotted it, leaving a tail any traveler could untie. Night exhaled across the plain, carrying the last scent of lie from the dismantled chapel and the sweeter promise of damp earth ready for bloom. The 2 watchers mounted, turned their horses west. An iron shoe clinked once more, a traveling note faint enough to follow a listener into sleep. Ledger, 0 planted, 36 to grow, 1 road west. The smoky hill trace lay so flat that dusk seemed to iron it smooth. 2 horses walked west, their shadows stretching like yardsticks across grey grass. Marshal Grant Adams carried the oil-wrapped ledger beneath his coat. The twine had cut a pale groove through his shirt, a balance line worn into living cloth. Clara Plain rode beside him, eyes measuring the horizon as once she measured graves. Her skirt hem unraveled into blunt zeros that fluttered against the mare's flank. Neither spoke. The wind supplied syllables of grit and sage. They reached a half-framed chapel at the lip of a dry creek. Fresh pine uprights smelled of sap, yet no crosspiece interrupted the sky. Elder Hiram emerged dusted white with flour, greeting the riders with a mumbled psalm. Adams answered with a nod. The scripture was accepted as coin. Inside, rifle slots sawed the daylight into pale bars. The marshal unknotted the oilcloth, uncorked his ink, and wrote 12 names beneath the printed heading spring stock. Living names, ink dried almost before the final stroke, as though the paper feared erasure. A freighter arrived leading a mule whose ribs tallied higher than his crates. He refused the tin cup until Adams pressed the wildflower stamp against his receipt. Paper-proof, he muttered. Tastes sweeter than creek alkali. Clara watched him swallow, then watched the marshal blot the page. She understood that ink had become a currency harder than silver and lighter than conscience. At dusk, they passed a deserted relay station. A cedar gate leaned, its board marked by an ox yoke sigil chalked, so thick it gleamed like a bone plate in the failing light. Adams paced 23 snapped goral poles, tallying each break with a soft click of his tongue. He chalked a circle where the well gave back no echo. The silence accepted the figure without protest. Clara tore a strip from her skirt diary, traced the sigil, and pinned the paper to the lintel with a splinter. The page shivered, a lone witness refusing burial. She left it there, a pennant for westbound eyes. Night travel brought them to mile 560 and a government survey stone. Adams fed 3 mesquite sticks to a modest fire, flames turned the blank pages gold and black by turns. Between entries, Clara pressed a 5-petaled wildflower, the first to survive since Fort Kearny, blotting it so chlorophyll would not smear the numerals. 24 names now rose and fell with the marshal's breathing. None was struck through. Ink thickened in the cold. He confessed that figures once stank of lye and corpse tally. Now they smelled of creek water and yesterday's bread. Clara answered only with the rustle of seed packets in her pocket. 36 promises still sealed. From the cart tail, an ox shoe wind catcher grazed an iron ring, issuing a chime pitched to the note once sung above bars. Tonight, it counted living miles, nothing more. The marshal closed the book, satisfied the balance read 24 souls forward, 0 backward. Yet beneath his thumb the paper still felt warm, as though another entry waited to be born. Ledger, 24 living, 0 struck. 1 smithy cough, still unaccounted. Wind chime standing guard. The cough drifted across the coals, dry as corn husk, repeating every 4th breath. Adams lifted his head. The sound came from the shadowed wagon where the blacksmith had rolled himself in a tarp after supper. Clara already moved, skirt brushing dust as she knelt. She pressed 2 fingers beneath the man's beard, counting beats while the fire popped. 23, then a skip, then 24, steady enough to keep in the black. She unpinned a violet from her diary, slid it between the pages beside the newest name, and dated the margin with a cautious slash. The marshal watched without comment. He had learned her lexicon of petals: pink for infants, blue for travelers, violet for uncertain recovery. When she returned to the fire, she laid another stick, sending sparks westward like tiny riders, seeking asylum. Adams reopened the ledger, ruled a faint pencil line beneath the smithy's entry, and left the right-hand column blank. Space for repentance, space for relapse, space for the road still rolling. Wind soughed through the wheel spokes, flipping the corner of the wrapping cloth until he anchored it with his thumb. Above them, the stars kept their own tight tally, neither subtracting nor adding, only witnessing. Somewhere beyond the invisible horizon, a dog barked once, then thought better of it. Clara loosened the cinch on her mare, letting the animal blow. The saddle groaned like an old pew giving confession. She glanced at the marshal, saw the flicker of reflected flame across the scar that crossed his left cheekbone. A pale ledger line, written by a different kind of chalk. He felt her stare, answered with the smallest tilt of the book, as if to say the balance still holds. She answered by pressing another seed packet into his coat pocket. Corn this time golden and smooth. He buttoned it in, patted the bulge twice, and listened to the night settle into the hush of pencil lead whispering across paper. The iron triangle above the smithy gate clanged 9 times, paused, then clanged once more, a 10th deposit pressed into the wind. Clara plain counted both rings and added them to her mental column for unquiet metal. Marshal Grant Adams sat his horse a length behind, reins loose, so the blank ledger rested against his ribs. Oil from the wrappings seeped through his coat, smelling of rye straw and printer's glue, the scent of a story still weighing whom to spare. Below the rise, half-built corrals hugged Bitter Creek in crooked rectangles. Ox shoes numbered to 100 hung from every post. Flint, stripped to the waist, fed the forge with cottonwood so dry it combusted before touching coal. Each inward breath dragged the same 3-note cough across his lungs. Clink, wheeze, rasp. Clara had timed the interval at the last ridge. The beat had not slipped by half a second. Ledgers and lungs, keeping perfect time even when the soul overdrew. She dismounted. Dust puffed around her boots, carrying a faint sting of lye, though the nearest soap kettle stood 2 territories east. She attributed the odor to memory. Grief travels faster than wagons and carries caustics on its breath. Inside her skirt remained 36 seed packets of the original 37. The missing aster had been pressed into Flint's scar at dawn. Its ash now rode his palm like a second lifeline. She touched the vacant pocket and felt a tooth-shaped absence. Space enough for new syllables. Flint lifted a bar to the anvil. The tip glowed the color of a wedding ring melted in Missouri, gold thin to wire, wire coiled to nail, nail driven through cedar to Market Chapel door. He rotated the iron so the marshal could see the brand underneath, a crude cross of four pawks, the stamp that once turned cattle into tithes. The gesture served as confession in a country where words cost extra postage. Adams opened the ledger across a cedar stump. The right-hand column waited, ruled but uninked, a gallows without rope. He recited the warrant totals in a voice flat as tin. 19 graves in Kansas, 9 in Nebraska, 2 in Colorado, 1 breather still unaccounted for. The arithmetic equaled 31. Yet the echo said 100. Flint's stutter answered, consonants sticking like hot iron to skin, confirming the tally without naming the dead. He laid the glowing bar across both palms the way a deacon displays a chalice, then tilted it toward earth, letting gravity strike first. Clara stepped between barrel and brand. She removed her right glove, revealing the violet smear chalk had printed that morning, a ledger entry written on flesh. With the same hand, she pressed the bellows shut, dimming the forge to ember dusk. Night air rushed in, bringing the odor of cooling iron, a smell that reminded her of plowshares, winter stoves, shackles filed thin. She asked whether a man who keeps the tally might also keep the mercy, since both are tools forged by use. Flint's reply hissed as skin met metal. The cross sank into his palm with a sound like damp cloth upon hot stone, softer than any court page turning. He held the bar until starlight no longer glimmered on red, until ownership reversed itself and the brand belonged to him alone, sealed in scar. Only then did he release the iron. It rang once against the anvil, a cold amen, then rolled beside the aster ash already blending with cinder. Adams snapped the ledger shut without committing ink. Law, he seemed to decide, owns no calipers for a wound that balances itself. From the ruined chapel across the creek, a wind catcher of discarded ox shoes answered the iron's note, distant, metallic, like a congregation forgetting whom to mourn. A manacled flint with the calm used for measuring survey stones, each click sounding remarkably like a hammer striking shoe. Clara reopened the book only to tear out one sheet. In small copperplate she wrote, Flint, paid in full. Ink feathered outward like frost on glass, black crystals seeking edges. Before the letters dried, she folded the paper twice and slipped the wafer between branded palm and cuff chain, so evidence and absolution might travel together. Thus the column closed, yet the sum stayed portable, denying the grave its customary annex. The marshal nailed the still warm ox shoe to the corral gate as notice and as marker. One blow, two, three, each strike rang brighter than any bell that had once summoned victims to him. The sound carried until it thinned into breeze, a ledger of iron notes no voice need read aloud. Two riders turned west, hoofbeats muffled by dust. The pageless book riding between them, accountability measured mile by mile. Far behind, the triangle of shoes above the abandoned forge trembled in the wind, giving off a faint chime the listeners could carry beyond sight.